The Ukraine has become a battleground between the East and the West, both politically and militarily. The country has been ridiculed for its snap elections, and Russia blamed for reacting badly to Western policies. Meanwhile, the mainly Russian-speaking regions in the east of the country have become the scene of deadly clashes between pro-Russian protesters and the Ukrainian army, as Kiev has launched military operations since mid-April to crush the protests. The West backed armed protesters intent on overthrowing the democratically elected government in Kiev. Then, in a dramatic example of double standards, America condemned Russia for backing those who wanted to maintain strong links with them. In Kiev, the US-backed regime has cancelled Russian-language television programming and attempted to suppress protests against the new government. US Secretary of State John Kerry has praised those overthrowing the state and attacked those who are unhappy at the downfall of the previous administration. The shooting down of a commercial airliner over the country has been seized upon to condemn Moscow's apparent backing for those groups which prefer a strong relationship with the East, and this has served to increase tensions. So why did America feel justified in helping the overthrow of a democratically elected government in another country? Why did Washington criticize Moscow for backing those unhappy with this turn of events? And should the West be interfering in the affairs of state in another sovereign country in the first place? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by asking the American people how much they actually know about the current situation in the Ukraine. Here's what they said.
I think unfortunately it's devolved into ultra-nationalist and ethnic tensions, which is a real shame, and ultimately it began as a just revolution against authoritarian, autocratic, and repressive government for the benefit of the people.
I think that it's troubling for the United States, Russia, and many other countries because it's causing a lot of unrest in Ukraine, and the people, there are two different sides, one that supports joining the European Union and one that doesn't. So it's essentially like a civil dispute.
Well, I think it's about the conflict between a portion of the country which wants to join the European Union or NATO, and the other portion of the country which wants to stay within the sphere of influence of Russia, and it more or less comes down to sectarian, well, not sectarian, but ethnic differences.
I, when reading, got very confused with a lot of like the Russian separatists and like the different conflicts in Ukraine. So what do I think about it? I think that like the information being fed to us is kind of unclear, at least as a student, so I get kind of lost. And what it's about, I don't know much about what it's about. But again, like very unclear on my part.
It's definitely a political issue. It seems like there is a smaller group of people in Ukraine who want independence, want their own type of government, and that they're not being allowed to have that. It seems also very involved with the situation in Russia and how Vladimir Putin wants to just have a lot of control of a lot of things, and he has a lot of power that he can use in these situations with smaller countries that don't have as much power.
Well, basically, I think it's some kind of a conflict between maybe big powers, let's say, and I think one is Russia, and the second is U.S. and EU together. So these big powers are fighting, especially in the borders of many countries. One of the countries is Ukraine.
So those are the views of the American public. But what is this conflict all about, and what is the current situation in the Ukraine? We asked our experts.
Well, it's about two countries in one, essentially. There's West and Central Ukraine, which is Western-leaning, clearly. Idealistic in that, perhaps. But certainly the east of Ukraine is Russia-leaning. And that's the intrinsic conflict in Ukraine. With the overthrow of the legitimate government in February of this year, whatever you think of the government, and it wasn't particularly an attractive one, but still the point is that the split in the country that had always been there has now come to a head because of this exacerbation of tensions brought about by, indeed, outside interference?
There are two dimensions to the conflict in Ukraine. It's partly the latest episode in a series of factional struggles between the elite that inherited power in the Ukraine since 1991, where all factions are pretty corrupt and politically quite cynical. The second element is a kind of proxy war between the United States and the European Union on the one hand and Russia on the other.
So why did the United States support an armed uprising against a democratically elected government? And was it right to get involved? We put that challenging question to the American people.
Well, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary and proper to overthrow a repressive and autocratic regime that trances or steps upon the rights of the people, I think the United States will, generally speaking, support that sort of revolution, as well as any revolution that will check the interests of one of our competitors, Russia. So I think that both geopolitical and idealist interests were at play.
I personally, do not believe that it was right to get involved. I think that this is kind of a very surface answer, but I think that that was kind of something that goes against a lot of our beliefs, our democratic beliefs, and to get involved kind of like raises a lot of conflict within our own nation that's sort of unnecessary.
I don't think it was right to get involved. I think that the U.S. gets involved in a lot more than they should. They try to be sort of the global police and they shouldn't.
I'm not sure if they have done that or not, but my general opinion has been less U.S. involvement in that conflict is better from my perspective.
I don't think it was right to get involved. I really do believe that we don't understand the issues in the Ukraine, and that though we're well-intentioned and we're willing to support many different people, we do have constituencies in the United States, a large Ukraine population that demands our attention in the Ukraine. But I think we supported it somewhat, but not significantly, and we kind of gave the pallor of a Cold War issue once again.
For an objective analysis of America's motivations for being involved in the Ukraine and its justification for doing so, we turn to our experts.
Well, the U.S. is pursuing a twofold aim in this. One is to prevent any sort of rebirth, recreation of what they perceive as a Russian empire or a Soviet empire in any shape or form. So that's task number one. I guess in geopolitical, cynical terms, there's a reason behind there's rationale. Another, we can talk about how dangerous to the world a recreation of some kind of Soviet Union or Russian Empire is. That's debatable. But anyway, that's, I think, the school of thought in Washington. The other main aim of Washington in this is to drive a wedge between Russia, current modern Russia, and Europe, and to tie Europe to the United States. And of course, the rechanneling, say, of energy flows from Russia to Europe and replace it with energy flows from the US to Europe. That serves the same purpose, to drive a wedge between Russia and Europe and to avoid the creation of a pretty powerful economic alliance between Russia and Europe that would provide a counterbalance to the US, to their world global hegemony.
Well, I don't think it was simply an armed uprising. It's true that there was fighting on the streets and violence, but to be honest, on both sides, the government and its opponents. And what there was a kind of parliamentary coup in which some of the previous supporters of the government and the very rich oligarchs backing them switched sides and overturned Yanukovych. Why did the Americans support it? They supported it because the result was a pro-Western government.
The West went on to condemn those campaigners who were unhappy with the overthrow of their democratically elected government. How do the American people feel about this apparent contradiction?
Well, I wasn't aware of that, so I don't know, I guess they're just flip-flopping based on what the popular opinion is. That's what it seems like. I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable enough to, I don't think, answer that.
Well, there's definitely a contradiction here. I just think it's okay because the United States is working for its own benefit and its own interests, and that makes sense. But I can see why it's kind of like hypocritical kind of contradiction there, but I don't know, I think it's okay. I agree with it.
By campaigners, that's kind of a tricky question, because campaigners, you can say people like rejecting it and saying we didn't want our government overthrown, and that's a fair point because, you know, part of the country did elect this guy. So, but then it degenerated into violence, and at that point, that's something that is always reprehensible. So of course you condemn violence of that nature, especially if it's supported by foreign nations. And I don't think we should support the Ukrainians in this, but I mean, you kind of got to let them sort it out themselves.
How do I feel? I mean, I think that, like, again, what I said, them getting involved is going to have a contradiction. So I think like the US and the EU should have expected this in the beginning.
I think it's probably just politics, and that there are things going on behind closed doors that we don't know enough about, and that whatever it is, they're just sort of trying to send a message to whatever public they're trying to reach at the given moment. I mean, so obviously I don't think it's a good contradiction, but it's expected.
Well, if it's their democratic elected government, then it should be theirs, and we probably shouldn't be involved in it.
So that's what the public feel. We turn to our experts for a further analysis of what looks like a glaring contradiction in Western policy with regard to the Ukraine.
Well, that is the inconsistency. That is the double standard, if you will. It was fine to use force to overthrow Yanukovych, the legitimately, lawfully elected president of Ukraine in February 2014. But when the same is done by people in East Ukraine, those who are Russia-leaning and who are against severing their relations with Russia, then that is unacceptable. Just as back in February, January, and December, the US and some Western capitals were warning the then President Yanukovych not to use arms, not to use force against protesters, who were quite extreme, nationalist extreme, neo-Nazi quite strong among them. So there were those warnings. But when people in East Ukraine applied similar or the same methods, then that was taboo.
Well, if we look at the history of American foreign policy, the United States has a long history of interfering in countries, even if the governments have been democratically elected, where it doesn't like those governments' policies and their geopolitical alignment. So it's nothing new. This is the latest stage in an old game. The State Department official responsible, Victoria Nuland, is a neoconservative left over from the George W. Bush administration. So this is very much the kind of approach to global politics that she's very comfortable with. So it's not surprising.
Why is the West criticizing Russia for supporting its allies in the Ukraine when America itself is doing exactly the same thing in the same country with its allies? We put that question to the public.
They say it's because they're trying to protect the Ukrainian government from being taken over by Russia, but like at the end of the day, it's just about Russia or America protecting its interests in the area. I'm pretty sure America has got some bases there in the region at least, so it makes sense for them to want to do that.
I think first of all you have to kind of look at what the word support means. There's evidence that shows that Russia is directly providing the rebels in eastern Ukraine with military hardware, tanks, assault weapons. In many instances, Spetsnaz troops have actually entered Ukraine, have participated in military activities with these eastern Ukrainian rebels. They've led certain expeditions and they've come into conflict with Ukrainian troops. So Russia is actively militarily supplying the Ukrainian rebels, and the United States has not done that. They've provided non-lethal assistance. There have been talks of providing them directly with weapons, but at this point, the U.S. is still hesitant because it doesn't know what impact that's going to have on the regional balance, and also the U.S.'s relationship with Russia, because they don't want to exacerbate that even more. So the U.S. has offered political support, whereas Russia has offered military support, and there's definitely a big difference with that and kind of how that impacts the region.
Good question. I mean, that is hypocritical in its own sense, but I also think that the way Russia's going about doing it is inherently wrong, because you can say, the country has elected to move one way or another, and that's fine, but at this point the country is physically fighting, and to interfere in a civil war like that just to support a regime which wants to move towards your government as opposed to moving towards the EU is wrong. I mean, you can also say the same thing about us supporting rebels in Syria, but that's also a different story because that guy's barrel bombing people, so that's not so cool.
I think it's, again, I don't know enough about it, but I think it's probably a power issue in that the U.S. and Russia are vying for power of some sort. So if the U.S. sees that Russia has some sort of allegiance to some other group and the U.S. doesn't want that to happen, they will just as easily come in and say, well, we're okay to have these allegiances because we're the U.S. and you're Russia, and so we get that privilege and you don't.
Well, I think it's even more important than that. This goes back to Kosovo, where the Americans supported Kosovo's independence for Serbia, where the Russians supported the Serbian continuation of Kosovo being there. And that issue went to the UN courts, and the UN court decided that, well, Kosovo didn't violate any laws and they can be separated. What you see here is Russia applying the same technique to the Ukraine, and the United States forgetting their own history, and that they caused the ability to those separations. Ultimately, you look at it today, that separation has occurred, and that kind of issue is over.
So while America supports its allies in the Ukraine, it seems to be condemning Russia for doing exactly the same thing. We turn to our experts for their perspective on this apparent hypocrisy.
Well, the U.S., I think, should start with looking back at the time when it jumped into the conflict. It shouldn't have been there. And the conflict exacerbating back in November of 2013 was, to a large degree, due to Western interference. They stimulated the conflict. They saw it as a chance to gain a significant geopolitical victory, to wrest Ukraine, all of Ukraine, from Russia, and appropriate it effectively.
Well, it's thoroughly hypocritical of the West to condemn Russia, because the West is very actively involved in what's going on in Ukraine. But it has to be said, Russia also is involved in Ukraine. I think the evidence that Russian troops have been fighting in eastern Ukraine is very hard to refute now. And Russia supplied weapons and other sorts of support to the rebels in eastern Ukraine. So what we have is two outside powers, both behaving in an imperialist way. The US asserting itself through its supporters and backing its supporters, and similarly Russia intervening through its supporters and providing them with backing.
So should America and the West be interfering in the internal politics of the Ukraine in the first place? And what is likely to be the result of this meddling? We asked the public.
Well, I don't think the United States should be involved in all internal politics of Ukraine, simply the ones that may affect the United States itself or its allies. And Russia getting itself involved in this situation does affect the United States. And so I think it's okay for the United States to get involved in that case, but not in all internal politics. I think Ukraine should be autonomous in that it's a country itself.
Interference, it's hard to make a judgment call on, because interfering risks escalation and stuff like that. So I think nothing more than economic support at this point for the Ukrainian government is really a good option. And the repercussions of it are, hopefully the Ukrainian government will stabilize itself over time, and there'll be some kind of peace accord with all parties involved, but I don't know, we'll see.
It's not a situation that we have, not to bring up Iraq, which is another controversial issue, but it's not sort of a do or die situation where we think that there might be some type of weaponry or something going on inside of the state that is actually a global threat. Ukraine, it seems like it's much more a local political issue, and that it should be solved by the people who are living there. And I don't think it's our business. I think we can support it. It would be much better if we sort of supported or went against things with a global alliance, like the UN or something, rather than just on our own terms.
I would say no. I'm still, again, from the viewpoint where the U.S. involvement in this issue specifically is probably not the best idea.
Well, they already are, so that's that. Like, we're already very involved. I think the result is going to be a lot like what we've seen in other nations, that there isn't going to be a result. It's going to be like, it's basically like a civil war, and then whoever ends up beating out the other one and that will be like either pro-Russia or pro-United States, and that will be determinant of who wins, and then that will be the side that Ukraine is on.
Well, there's no doubt that America and the West are involved in the Ukraine, but should they be? What is likely to be the end game? We gave the last word to our experts.
We're already seeing the results. The country is split. It's not coming back together, not in the foreseeable future, not under this government that is currently in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. Part of the country is gone, of course, Crimea, and that's done and dusted. East Ukraine is not coming back. So that's what they like to call it, a popular revolution. That's what it's resulted in. The country, the uprising back in February against oligarchs, against injustice, against corruption, the motives were noble and clear, and one could sympathize with those. But what do we have? We have oligarchs in power again. We've got corruption not diminishing, but probably growing. We've got private oligarch armies fighting in East Ukraine against the sort of pro-Russia insurgents. We've got a political landscape that is now ultra-nationalist. In some streaks are neo-Nazi, all of them anti-Russian, or pretty much all of them. So, and you've got the population, even in those areas that are pro-Western, there are deep splits between the population, between between the political ideologies and allegiances. So it's a bad turn for Ukraine as a united country, and I don't think it's coming back together again, not in this generation.
Well, we've already, one result we've already seen, which is a war in which several thousand people have died and a lot of physical destruction has taken place. And as is true generally in wars, most of those people were innocent. And it's a great tragedy, because what we're seeing is a country that is very poor, that has huge internal problems, becoming a battleground between the great powers. And both the US and Russia, I think, have a very heavy responsibility here. And they should really step back and allow the Ukrainian people to settle their own future.
From the start of the current conflict in the Ukraine, the West has been supporting pro-Western forces and condemning Russia for assisting those who wish to maintain strong links with Moscow. The contradictions are clear. This is not about doing what's best for the Ukraine. It's about doing what's right for America and Western powers. Another stark reminder that, regardless of the rights and wrongs of intervention, America's activities in the Ukraine will be guided by one consideration alone: self-interest.